Okay, do you want me to go ahead with the intro, Julie, or wait?
Would it be Todd, Allison chime in? I'm thinking if we can wait another minute or so, would that be okay?
Sure.
Thanks.
We're just gonna take that time off the top of yours.
I'll just not ask a question to allow for that time. It's the least I can do.
I'll also skip my song. I won't sing the song.
Oh, thankfully.
There's Tracy.
Sorry, I was in a different session.
Cue up the music.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Harvey. I am a member of the Innovation Advisory Team, and I'll be monitoring the chat today. This session will be recorded for future use. It's my pleasure to introduce Julie Rowan, Allison Bernknopf, Tracy Russo, and Todd Stanislav for their presentation, Shift the Paradigm from Pandemic Constraints to Agile Course Design.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. I know there's a lot of really great programming on today. I've already picked out things that I'm excited to get the recording of when those may become available. But it's nice to be able to spend the next not quite an hour with all of you. We are here to talk a little bit about the Agile Course Design Institute that we facilitated over the summer. Give you a quick outline of what the session is going to involve. We'll talk a little bit about some factors that we'd identified as being especially important in terms of Agile thinking or Agile planning, in addition to general course design. Then you'll get a glimpse into how we considered these factors in the design of the ACDI, and then how participants considered these factors as they work to design their courses for the fall or the spring. We'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end, but there'll also be an opportunity at one point kind of in the middle of the session when you'll have a chance to engage. So we're not letting you off the hook. You'll have a chance to speak up and ask some questions as we go. But to get started, we'll take a quick look at what we started calling our dashboard, or some factors that can be especially important. They're important for any course design really, but can be especially important when you're trying to build in some Agile thinking or some Agile planning. You might recall, perhaps you are reluctant to recall, but you might recall that there was a lot of uncertainty around what spring, summer, fall was going to look like, and recognizing that things perhaps feel a little more settled or optimistic, but there may be some lingering uncertainty. And so we wanted to help as we struggled ourselves to engage in getting accustomed to this and trying to think a little more flexibly about what we might do. We wanted to engage Course Design Institute participants in the same types of things. So we sort of created this sandwich with the top piece of bread being some really traditional course design components and processes, things like identifying course learning outcomes, planning for assessments, and then just selecting appropriate teaching and learning activities. And then the bottom piece of bread is thinking about how those different things might look depending on your delivery format. And we envisioned a delivery format as potentially being a spectrum of being totally face-to-face, totally asynchronous online, or some mix of the two, and possibly some movement along the spectrum during the semester. So then in the middle of these two pieces of bread, I invite you to imagine these as any of your favorite fillings: cheese, roast beef, mine would be chicken. But we identified a sense of belonging, bandwidth, and interaction and engagement as being things that could be both very challenging to think about when planning for agility and also very, very important. And so sense of belonging, we sort of operationalized as constituting that feeling of community, sharing power where possible with and among students, attending the student sense of academic and social integration, especially since they might not have access to their normal social activities on campus. So that contextualizing that in in a classroom could be really important. So those were all aspects of the sense of belonging piece. Bandwidth, very often when folks talk about bandwidth, we tend to think of it in a technical, internet access, uploads and download speeds. But for our purposes, we drew on the work of Sia Verschelden, who talks about bandwidth as constituting not just the technical components, but the cognitive load, which was so heavy for so many people. The stresses, right? Those affective, the social and emotional abilities that we had, both the stress of isolation or the lack of engagement, and how that might differentially affect different people, and how the different environmental factors of not only the pandemic, but other things could affect those things. And then finally, interaction and engagement, which could show up in anything from content creation, right? Designing PowerPoint slides, building in quizzes, linking students to external content, to demonstrating concepts and skills, and also making sure students would have a chance, whatever the format might be, to practice and play with concepts and skills, and building in some choice, right? Knowing that a lot more variables and potential challenges might be facing not only students, but also you. And so where possible, giving students some choice in how they might represent their learning. So those were the variables that we considered. And then we interlaid into these, what we called this dashboard, some really useful strategies and practices that come from what we know about neuroscience and the science of learning. And Todd's going to talk about those.
Thanks, Julie. In thinking about the design of the Agile Course Design Institute, and I'll probably resort to ACDI, we gave a lot of consideration to the kinds of content, the information that we wanted to share and engage faculty with. And among the content that we settled on was to bring some attention to ideas and practices from the science of learning. That is, those ideas and practices for which there's a compelling research basis for using them in the teaching and learning process. And we settled on 6. And these are the first 3: attention to prior knowledge, retrieval or retrieval practice, and spaced learning or spacing. And then the second group of 3, an idea called interleaving, and then attention to sleep and stress. And for each of these 6, we sought to answer these 3 questions during ACDI. What is each of these? Why would we want to pay attention to those in our courses? And how do we do that? So to kind of illustrate how we did that, I'll focus on 2 of the 6. This will be an admittedly abbreviated treatment of how these ideas surfaced and how we attended to them in ACDI. But so with regard to retrieval or retrieval practice, we often think about learning as just getting information into students' heads or helping them develop skills. And retrieval practice, on the other hand, is about getting information out. And it's a strategy in which we know that calling information to mind subsequently enhances learning significantly. Which brought us to the research and answers this question of why. So we gave considerable time to thinking about what the literature has to say about the benefits that retrieval practice have. Clearly, there's a strong evidence that retrieval practice demonstrates that it's a more potent learning strategy than other techniques that are commonly used. Techniques that are certainly appropriate, but perhaps not as impactful or have the greatest impact on student learning. Strategies that we commonly use, like lecturing, or that students use for rereading or even taking notes. While valuable, they sometimes don't have as much impact as other kinds of retrieval practices, which brought us then to the third question of then how do we do this? What are some retrieval practices that the literature has shown yield significant gains in learning and retention of knowledge and skills? And among the ideas that surfaced are these: using low stakes frequent assessments, both those done by individuals and in groups, using a teaching technique developed by Eric Mazur at Harvard called peer instruction, and then a few other examples using exit cards that ask students to recall from memory, using kind of verbs like describe, list, and so forth. Using strategies that ask students to write study questions about content and then to use those at different times leading up to an assessment. And then any number of other practices that we could use that ask students to recall information and skills from memory. A second example that surfaced during ACDI was to give some attention to spaced learning or spacing. And we know that retrieval practice is an effective way to learn and retain knowledge, but research also shows that what's really key to successful learning via retrieval is not so much the total time spent learning, but the way in which that time is distributed. So spaced practice brings us to this idea that it's a technique that can significantly improve learning without really changing the amount of time that students devote to learning. So it's a practice that involves taking a given amount of study time and arranging it so that it happens over multiple instances that are spread over time. This is in contrast to something in the literature that's called massed studying, or we all better know as simply cramming. So based on a wealth of research, we know that a spaced practice approach results in longer retention and deeper learning. So in the Institute, we gave some attention to what are ways to try to promote a spaced practice approach. And among the ideas that surfaced was to think about studying, again, not as one long cramming session, but rather to space those out over time in smaller chunks. Admittedly, my own review sessions for exams often mirrored a massed studying approach. So we encourage faculty to think about how to use review sessions in a spaced approach, having fewer of those spaced over time. Certainly that's the same advice we'd want students to follow for studying. Other ideas that surfaced was to pay attention to ways to assess students in cumulative ways over the course of a semester, and so forth. You can see two other examples there. So finally, to help faculty think about then how to integrate any one or more of these practices or ideas into their courses, we first had them, if you look at the middle column, kind of do an inventory of ways in which they already attend to each of the 6 practices, ways that they attend to them in their courses, ways that they talk to students about those practices. And then following the time that we devoted during the Institute to each of the 6, we then asked the faculty to think about additional ways that they could integrate one or more of those 6 practices into the design of their courses. So that gives, between what Julie and I have shared, we've kind of given you a sense of kind of an overarching framework using the dashboard as a way to think about Agile course design. I shared some examples of the content that we introduced and engaged faculty with during the Institute. Now I wanted to hand this off to Allison first and then Tracy, who each can share with us some examples of ways that our own Agile thinking was used to shape different kinds of activities and work during ACDI.
Thank you, Todd, for that transition. And so here are the examples of the different aspects. And we thought about all of these, as Todd said, when we were introducing them, and in Julie's portion as well. So what I wanted to do is really focus on the specific component. And the one that I'm looking at is really one of the core course design components that we've had throughout the entire course design iterations that we've had over the years. And really look at it from this agility standpoint and what we did before and how we needed to think agilely about how we planned, and hopefully to give you some mental thought behind the curtain as to why we did this as it relates to bringing this into your classrooms or your other training settings that you're in. So really, if we think about this from a norms and mindset standpoint, these are really the expectations of how we expect people to behave in the classroom, both the learners and the teacher, how we expect the learners to approach their learning, how we as faculty will approach that. And we really tried to do a couple of things with the Course Design Institute. One is we have a set of learners in front of us who are faculty in this case, but really try to model when we could the various aspects of teaching, given that we are in this teacher learner setting, but also teaching to our peers. And the thing about community norms and mindset is that really there's this sense of belonging that it really impacts. So if you create this environment that is safe and protected and feel comfortable and create this sense of community, you've got this sense of belonging. And when students don't necessarily have that, or your learners don't have that, there can be significant issues with bandwidth. So their affective piece might take up their cognitive bandwidth because they're worried about whether or not they belong to this community. And so they can't focus on the learning as much if they don't have that sense of belonging. It can also impact their interaction and engagement. They might not engage and interact as significantly as if they do feel that sense of community with their fellow learners. And especially when you're dealing with controversial topics or things that are more difficult, if they feel that they are safe and can express their feelings more safely, they're more willing to do that. So in the pre-pandemic iterations of the Course Design Institute, we really had this closed community. Faculty were there for a week with us, about 40 hours for that week, and they were all interacting and engaging at the same time with the material and together. And one of the aspects of student-centered learning is giving and sharing control with the learners. So this was one area that we tried to model as a great way that you can share that control. And so the participants, after a nice icebreaker, would then create the community norms and mindsets that we would then discuss and clarify and finalize and put up in the room so that we had this nice reminder every day and that what the community norms were. And if we needed to revisit any, we could. And that was something that we were all in invitation to. And then obviously, as you all know, the pandemic came and we had to look at different ways that we were going to plan. So in our thinking of this, as we were planning the ACDI, we had to think about what kind of participations would the faculty be interested in and be able to commit to. So instead of going with this closed community for a week, we decided to open the community and spread out the learning, a bit of that spacing, over a 4-week period. So it's the same amount of time commitment, about 40 hours, but it was more of a come and go as you could. So participate as little or as much as you were able to do. And that could be coming to the live sessions, but it could also be reviewing the material after it was recorded. So given those parameters, we decided actually to just create the norms this year. And we did, though, really consciously decide how are we going to do that, but still give our learners a sense of sharing control over those norms. So when we introduced them in the first session, we then invited conversation, get clarification, ask questions. What can we do to modify these? And so we offered an invitation to modify and adjust as necessary. So this was really just one area where we had an example of how you can really just adjust the thinking a bit. You might need to give more structure to something than you normally do in the past, but finding ways that we can also work with that and still value our learners and a student-centered approach. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Tracy, who is going to talk about another aspect of the Course Design Institute to give you a further example.
Thank you, Allison. For the next part, I want to talk about some ongoing pieces that we introduced deliberately, and I'm going to parse out how these all interacted with each other because, along with what Allison mentioned and Todd and Julie as well from the learning sciences, it wasn't really just this one event that we were looking at. We still don't have a solid plan as far as the pandemic is concerned going forward. However, we can rely on what we do know from the learning sciences and what we do know about quality teaching and pull from those certain elements to go forward with to make sure that faculty do feel confident in what they're doing. So in this slide, I just kind of shrank the sense of belonging because that's a lot of what Allison just addressed, and put the bandwidth and interaction and engagement kind of front and center, because those in the next part of this story of how we created this planning, those were like a chicken and egg. We couldn't talk about one without talking about the other. And I put the goal at the bottom, combine our experiences to create a model faculty could replicate for their own teaching, because what happened as a result of the pandemic, and I'll share some of this in the next slide, was e-learning and the Faculty Center coming together with this kind of, as Todd put it at one point, all hands on deck type of mentality. So I think it's important, to parse out, just like this happened to us. I mean, the bottom line, whether it's two faculty members who were talking prior to the pandemic about what they were teaching, e-learning in the Faculty Center, we'd had a couple of meetings looking forward to the summer because both of us have taught summer institutes in the past. Both of us, they focused on teaching course design for face-to-face. We focused on course design for online, but there's a lot of overlap. And we had been having these discussions, but it's important to note that prior pandemic, we really didn't perceive that we needed each other in a deep level sense. We did perceive that it's better for the institution, it's better for faculty if we figure out how to leverage any type of similar resources and to pull more faculty together, again, to bring more interactions. But there really wasn't a fundamental need to do things any differently than we had been doing them in the past. And then the pandemic hits. And I think, this, much like, whether it's here, whether it's a student, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's a staff member, when the initial pandemic hit, everybody had these, different isolated moments where we're all kind of, oh, what just happened? And then people start reaching out to each other. And so after the initial realization that, wow, we really need to transition how we're preparing faculty for what they're teaching, then we restarted our conversations. And, again, then it's transitioned to some deeper levels. So next slide, please. So this is basically, well, it's imaginary data in a lot of ways. There's no specified reason why the relationships and the size. I did not survey anything. However, this does come from a lot of anecdotal responses that we heard. And I wanted to start here because this experience and what happened to this bandwidth concern informed our teaching, and that is how we ended up focusing on some of the specific tools that we shared with everybody that even today, for example, have been used successfully with participants. So just looking at this, I identified some different ones, and I think a lot of you may see yourselves and your own experiences in this. Each person had kind of a different combination of factors that affected their bandwidth. Prior to this, that section that's kind of green with the just 4 bullets, prior to this, that was the majority of our focus. That was really all we were worried about, was looking at the course design, how to teach, sharing course information, interacting with students, assessing student work. And that got most of the full circle in terms of kind of like just thinking of the amount of bandwidth available. After the pandemic, and even through all the different stages of the pandemic, just thinking through these different areas of what was affecting everybody. Things like learning Zoom and Teams. So from the Faculty Center Teaching and Learning, it was interesting because they had didn't have as much time impact from the pandemic as e-learning, because e-learning was flooded with the technical support for everybody, but they had a bigger learning curve on some of the different ins and outs of some of the technologies as applied to teaching. In our case of e-learning, I was the only e-learning team member who had even enough cognitive bandwidth to be able to participate. So FCTL, Todd, Julie, and Allison graciously did a lot of the scaffolding work to allow me to participate in a limited way, because my bandwidth was changed with, all the logistics. And the nice thing that I find when we look at the concept of, cognitive bandwidth, effective bandwidth, is not only are no two people the same, you can look at this in terms of your students But you can also look at this in terms of over time. So as we all go forward, because again, in education, different storms can hit us, different initiatives, different things, and they always can come in and affect our bandwidth, but it's not a permanent thing. It's very dynamic. So what we want to talk about is how in the next slide, please, we chose specifically, in terms of those interaction and engagement, that's kind of like a through thread running through everything we did, because that's one of the features, whether it's thinking in terms of students learning in a class, people learning in a system, people connecting in the organization. If you have a system for interactions and engagement in place, you can weather all of these different storms. That's why in that initial image with the ships, I had just a little teeny tiny rope connecting, and it was very obvious it's not enough. But if you think about, in this image where you've got the person over the safety net, these are all the different interactions that we want to encourage. These aren't new interactions. A lot of what we shared in the ACDI based on agility, these weren't new concepts. The idea of, students interacting with content, students interacting with faculty, students interacting with each other, those aren't new. Those are traditional teaching and learning functions, tasks, constructs that we always try and attend to in different ways. But through the ACDI, we looked at exploring different tools that we felt comfortable that would be agile enough to be used for everybody. So some of the tools that we used, and we use these specifically so that every faculty member attending the ACDI got practice being a student in these environments. They got to see what they liked and didn't like about them. So that helped them be able to make more informed choices about what would work in their own setting. We wanted to make sure we exposed everyone to a small variety of tools across the week that we had already in our own context tested with each other and demonstrated to give people, again, before you want to teach something, of course, you always want to experience it for yourself, for the ins and outs, so that you're not, blindsided by something that doesn't work. So a couple tools, I just wanted to share some of the things. Todd mentioned spacing when he was talking about the learning sciences. One of the tools that can be leveraged super easily is that Zoom, whether you use Zoom, whether you use Teams, but it can help spacing in a lot of different ways because it allows us to record it so people can choose their own amount of space between when they're interacting with it. They can have more interactions, but it also affects other things beyond spacing because it allows people to view as many times as needed, to view at their convenience. And it essentially allows multiple interactions where prior, if we thought about a face-to-face classroom setting, there was only one set of interactions possible. You either could come or not, all or nothing. Zoom and then recording the Zoom and having that available in the Canvas classroom, that gives that agility of letting people come back, pick up where they missed. So maybe if their bandwidth was full, again, they could revisit it. The second area that we modeled a number of technology tools and strategies, again, all ones that have been tested, things like Padlet, things like the breakout rooms, and we are always happy both with Faculty Center and e-learning to help faculty going forward if you want to play and test with some of these. Jody Gardai does a lot of that same type of thing. But creating those spaces for interactions kind of in that real time, the equivalent of that small group discussion. With Zoom or Teams, when you're all just the squares, sometimes looking at people's name, that can be very off-putting. And so we wanted to make sure that we taught modeled tools that people could take forward, such as the breakout rooms where people could talk in small groups, or collaborative documents, like on a Padlet where people can all participate at the same time, adding in polls and things like that. Just different ways to allow people to interact in more than one option, just this, again, to not replace what happens in a face-to-face classroom, but to accept a different reality and to give options that promote some of those same types of multi-level interactions, keeping people connected. And with that, we'll first take questions if anyone has any questions for what Allison and I just covered, and then Julie's going to take it next after questions and explore how and share some of the stories of how participants did take the modeling into their own work. So if anyone has any questions at this point, we are happy to stop and answer them. And you can ask them to anyone on our group. We all participated in making this together, but. And feel free to put them in the chat as well. One thing that was interesting presenting in the ACDI with Julie, Todd, and Allison was that use of wait time. And I will tell you going forward, Julie is a master of wait time. I'm not going to have us all wait for a long time here, but it was interesting to see that transpire in a virtual setting because it is still very effective when you're teaching a class, when you do need, like for this setting, questions are great, but I don't need to have them. But when you're teaching a class, there are times you do want your students to respond before you move forward. And that wait time, it feels strange virtually, but when you employ it, Julie did a phenomenal job in the ACDI, and it's still a very effective tool. And I'm going to let Julie take over whenever she feels ready to start her section.
Thanks, Tracy. One thing that can be helpful, you may recall at the very beginning of the presentation, I kind of sort of primed you. I said, we're not necessarily going to wait until the very end to give you a chance for questions. So I'll re-extend that invitation, and I'll encourage you, if at any point you have questions in the 20 or so minutes that remain, please feel free to throw them into the chat window. Michelle's going to help us monitor them, and then that way we'll have them on sort of the table and we can come back to them as we go. Tracy and Allison were able to give some examples of how some agile thinking and planning informed our own preparation for ACDI, and we also have received permission from several of the participants who generously are allowing us to share examples of their own agile planning for their courses. So we'll talk about that a little bit here. Something that was really neat for me was, as Tracy indicated, kind of early on in the pandemic, we were so, I think she used the word flooded, it goes with that picture of a ship. We were so flooded with, requests for supports, and people were trying to just respond to, what do I do tomorrow? What do I do at the next class session? Those types of questions and answers. And we didn't always get to glimpse their longer term thinking. And so one thing that was really neat with ACDI was creating a space for a lot of advanced planning and thinking, and then being able to see the fruits of that and hear how that might play out in folks' plans. And so that's what we'll talk about. So in front of you is just one example of a template that we shared with participants to help encourage in their thinking and help them make some of their agile planning really explicit. So you'll notice, just for example, in that left-hand column that we're asking them in this case to think intentionally about if a learning outcome statement is even attainable in both a face-to-face or an online or a remote setting. And if it might not be, what accommodations might they have to make? And in some instances for folks teaching lab courses, those accommodations were really constrained. But throughout the ACDI, we use templates like this to help foster participants thinking around, what adaptations might they need to make and how they might account for those things like bandwidth and interactions and sense of belonging throughout their planning. So just wanted to share one example. What's more interesting is what participants actually decided to do. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples from a few different participants. So this is from Catherine Woods, and she teaches in the social work program. She was focused on a master's level clinical course. So the actual practice of clinical skills was really important, and interactions amongst students was really important. And a particular assignment that she was, or I should say like a topic in the course that she was focused on during the ACDI was preparing students to be able to conduct suicide assessments. So as you might imagine, that content is not only cognitively taxing, right? Having to know the resources, the protocols, the way to approach that, but it could also be affectively or emotionally taxing for a student to come to terms with being in the position of assessing suicidality in a client someday. So there's lots of layers to this assignment that she chose to focus on. And the way some agile thinking showed up in her work is represented on this slide. So again, just to highlight a couple, Catherine was really intentional with thinking about group work, and I'm looking over at sense of belonging. And she knew that using groups would be a really important piece to building community and helping students feel like if they're going to be working on this difficult content, they needed to feel safe and they needed to be able to reflect on their experiences with it. She had also heard that from students of color that very often working in groups could be further marginalizing for them. And so as she sought to come to terms with what she might do in an Agile setting, she decided that she would pre-assign groups and students would stay with the same group throughout the entire semester rather than using more ad hoc groups like she might use in a face-to-face class. And she also was explicit about her reasons for doing this with her students. Another example that shows up moving over to the bandwidth portion, Catherine noted that the class was 5 hours a week, so she decided to split it up and do 2.5 hours synchronously and the rest asynchronously. And she felt that splitting the time up would allow her to create a more engaging space during that 2.5 hours. And by having a more engaging space, it would help students manage their bandwidth by actually helping them focus on the content at hand, on the task at hand, despite the fact that they would have so many distractions in their lives. I'm going to jump down to course design components and process. And one big aspect of this course was that students would make videos of themselves engaging in clinical skills. And previously, students would record the videos and then they would watch everybody's videos in class face-to-face and give each other feedback. And Catherine decided that having, watching videos during a live Zoom session was perhaps not going to help with that engagement piece as much as she wanted to, and perhaps not the best use of time. So that goes back to why she decided to use groups. She decided to have students work in groups of 4 to watch each other's videos and give each other feedback. So that way they're still able to engage, to learn with and from each other, but the workload becomes more manageable. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next example here. So this comes from Dave McCall, who teaches in the developmental curriculum area. And Dave was working on a class that involved developing not only some reading skills, but also some college study habits, scheduling routines, those types of things. So if we start with sense of belonging, Dave noted at one point that he finds that the motivation of students can often be improved through teacher connections and relationships, but he thought that this would be challenging in an online course. So he decided to address this by intentionally building community through group work. Similar to Catherine, he wanted to give more attention to pre-assigning groups and making sure that groups were heterogeneous, that they had mixed skill levels so students could really capitalize on their ability to learn from each other. He also deliberately linked sense of belonging to his choice of delivery format. So he felt that building community and having opportunities to engage with each other was going to be really important. And so that's why he decided to have live Zoom classes, because not only would that let students connect with each other, it would also more closely imitate like a schedule and a routine and a sense of structure that these students needed. They needed to start developing those habits. And so he chose his delivery format to help mirror students' needs, to help support students' needs. Another example, I'll jump to interaction and engagement because we didn't highlight that one on Catherine's slide. So Dave worked really hard to identify a variety of tools that he might use to support his students in reaching the learning outcomes. And he decided to use things like Zoom breakout rooms so they could interact with each other. He used an online tool called Mentimeter, which lets students respond to questions and actually generates a word cloud that he can then share back with students for conversation and discussion. He wanted to make use of polling, which can be a great tool, both in Zoom or something like with Poll Everywhere. Polling can be a great tool for things like retrieval practice, spacing content out, coming back, using polls to sort of low stakes quizzing for students to see what they might remember. He also demonstrated how to actually create a video summary. So he wanted students to create video summaries, and so he showed them how to do that to help reduce some of that cognitive bandwidth that they might have in trying to learn that technology tool. Dave and Catherine both talked about using a number of things from Science of Learning. Dave talked a little bit about what he called spiraling, but it's actually another word for it is interleaving. And he noted that when he introduces a topic, he constantly circles back to it and includes it in a later activity. So that's a way of coming back to things and spacing out practice over time. I want to highlight just one thing from our next participant, and then we'll open the floor back up for questions. So this was a faculty member in the humanities department. We didn't receive express permission to use their name, so I'm going to leave it out, but I was especially struck by one thing that this person wrote when they taught, and this links to sense of belonging. They talked about having trust in students. And we asked faculty to consider at one point, 5 years from now, what do you want students to remember about this class? And what this person wrote was that they wanted students to remember, quote, that I was still a caring, helpful, and fair person, that I tried my best in the situation, and that I was clear and that I trusted that they were doing the best they could as well in this, as in the circumstances. And instilling a sense of we're in this together, I'm going to do as best as I can by you. I trust that you are doing the same and we're going to treat each other with grace. The idea of grace showed up often during the ACDI. And so when I saw this quote, I was really struck by it and I wanted to take this opportunity to share it with all of you today. So many other good ideas and connections to each of these elements showed up, not just amongst these 3 participants, but amongst many other participants. And I certainly don't want to give, short shrift to their work. But I know that we're limited on time. So let me pause and then open it back up to anybody who's here to ask questions about perhaps anything that you've heard us say, or if you're starting to get some ideas for things that you might want to do in your own courses, certainly welcome to ask us questions about that as well.
I thought it was interesting that Jim highlighted Todd's song, because that's something, the use of music was not directly a part of the ACDI. However, the use of music in when students enter your Zoom room playing music, and the use of having students select music and create playlists to meet certain cognitive areas and to use music as ways of explaining things in different texts has come up in many, many different dialogues recently. And I just thought it was interesting that in this context, Todd was skipping it, but in fact, music is something that in the online environment, it's very helpful to bring that in for that, again, for that sense of belonging. Students report liking coming in and hearing there's different sides. Sometimes they like hearing music from their peers. Other students talk about it when they enter a Zoom room for a classroom and the instructor is playing more peaceful music, calming music. So there's some different interesting things with music. I don't know if anyone else in this group has tried either variations with music or variations with other art forms as a way to address, the sense of belonging or the interaction and engagement issues. But I would be very curious to hear what people's experiences are.
I have a question for the group. After what you've seen and heard us share here, is there anything that you think we should have included that maybe we didn't? Like what might be missing from a course design institute that you think would be really valuable for faculty?
Well, and maybe I missed this because I had to step out for a moment, but do you talk about the use of stories and how stories can help with learning retention?
Well, you are taxing my memory, and that is a great question. I know that we have talked about that in other workshops that we have done, I want to say that it does show up as part of ACDI. I can't point specifically to where, but that's a great question and a great reminder.
Yes.
Something that's worth attending to.
Right, because I think it didn't show up explicitly in there. And I can also speak to even prior to this, when we had one that was just focused on online learning, it did not show up explicitly there, although it shows up in e-learning work that we've done related to digital storytelling and using storytelling as a way both to, be heard, be able to listen to other people, and then also to advocate for different things that you need. I teach, when I'm teaching instructional design, I teach specifically that digital storytelling is one of the tools currently if you were interested in making any kind of, reform or change. So we teach telling your own story digitally in that sense.
And I don't know, I'm with Julie. I'm not sure if it was ever in this current iteration, if it was expressly talked about, but I know we talked about different activities that people would do, and the cases and the stories and the real world examples brought in. And in some instances we modeled it a little bit in some of our in a couple of instances where we asked people to bring in their stories of their activities. So there was, but I don't know that we expressly addressed it like you're talking about.
We do have a question. How does one use music with Zoom? Is it just playing in the background and picked up by the microphone, or is there some trick to make it play?
Yeah, so from a technical perspective, say you wanted to show like a YouTube channel or something, you can just when you share your screen in Zoom, there's a box that you can check somebody else can remember exactly what the box says right now, but it's something like optimized for screen sharing. It may also say play computer. And I think in Teams, it might say then play computer sound then. And you can just make sure that box is checked, and then it'll play what is playing through your computer.
Yeah, there's two options. You can just do the share computer sound, which will share the sound. And then if you're doing video clips, you probably want to optimize screen sharing for video clips. So if it's just music you want to play, you could probably just hit the share computer sound. That it shows up when you click the share screen. It's on the very bottom.
And so Nikki said she has yet to use it, but her son's 6th grade science teacher uses it as students are entering her Zoom. It's great and well received by the students.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's interesting to hear.
You're also welcome to share if you don't have questions, but you have something that you do that either you knew was connected to bandwidth or sense of belonging or interaction, or that you're going, oh, I didn't even realize that what I was doing was promoting a sense of belonging, and you'd like to share an example from your own work, you're welcome to do so. So it is 1:19, and I know that we're about out of time. We would invite, if you have any follow-up questions or would like to continue the conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one or all of us. Tracy made a comment in her slide that the pie chart wasn't coming from any hard data, which reminded me of the saying that, right, the plural of anecdote is anecdata, right? So we were grateful that we could have these anecdotal stories and examples of participants that we could share with you. And they are just sort of representations of the enormous amounts of work that faculty put into evidencing how their Agile thinking was evolving and how they would be using that to the benefit of their students. And I want, from behalf of all of us, I just want to once again recognize the work and respect the work that the faculty did this summer. And be grateful for not only the work they did, but the ability to share it with all of you today. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. Oh,
Wait, and before we go, like I'd like to leave on this moment too, because it was an aha moment that Nikki said she had, and I didn't want to miss it because I think it's great. But that online teaching is giving a way to promote smaller chunks of learning at a time, and I think that's great. And one of the things that I've taken away from this too is what can I take from this online environment that I'm now going to bring back to me in the face-to-face environment, because there are some really great tools that I got forced to have to use in an online environment. And I was like, oh, Google Forms might be a great thing for me to bring in the classroom too when they're doing their group work. So, that's another thing to think about as you're going from, this transition. There's likely for most of you going to be a transition back to the classroom. So think about these kind of aha moments and those things that you brought that was new that you now can bring back to you in the face-to-face setting as well.
Great. Well, thank you to Allison, Tracy, Julie, and Todd. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for hosting. And again, thank you everyone for coming and just sharing your stories and all the work that you do. Have a great rest of Hatch to all the other sessions.
Bye.
Bye.